Welcome to Public Domain Book Club Hour. I'm my earring matches the book. um this is a bit of an audio test. This is the first time I have done Public Domain Book Club Hour in a while. I know I threatened to do an annual live read of Les Mis like every other year, but run into some issues with my inability to pronounce the French language and place and people names in French that leads to some issues with me giving up relatively quickly and hiding the evidence. So I will be rereading Sherlock Holmes. I haven't read a lot of it since high school. I know that there are some themes that deserve content warnings. As we move further in, I will do my best to be able to provide those ahead of time, but as this is a bit of a test, I did not have a chance to prepare that ahead of time for today. So, beware. I know that the back half of A Study in Scarlet is very, hello, hi, yes. Sound check went passably. Don't ask what's behind the curtain. It's chaos. Yeah. So, yes, as I was saying, I know the second half of A Study in Scarlet is very Mormon heavy, so, I don't know if we're going to get that far, and I will try to prepare content warnings ahead of time in the future, but this is a bit of a test run, so I have not had a chance to do that yet. As, of course, not everything that was written in the 19th century holds up to modern standards, and while that is a larger, broader conversation to have, I am mostly interested in rereading because I have become obsessed with the Sherlock & Co. podcast, which has thrown me headfirst back into all of my Sherlock Holmes brain rot, which is a lot. Like, by percentage as a human being, I am mostly Sherlock Holmes brain rot. Yeah. As far as loving when books are like spends a couple hours talking about something entirely different, here's how it relates to the normal story. Um yeah, that is the two book earrings that I got a not last weekend, the weekend before that, are Sherlock Holmes and Les Mis. Two stories that are infamously among the, and here's a lot of things that I promise are going to be yeah, here are some things that I promise are going to be relevant later. Don't worry, this will only go on forever. Yeah. So, again, into Public Domain Book Club Hour. Hang on, many pages. Another thing I've been thinking a lot about, a brief digression, a big one of the biggest lies in all of the things. But I have so much brain rot specifically for the meeting of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson in every adaptation. But like, there is something in my silly little neurodivergent brain that just the way that it is immediately into a situation where any rational human being, anyone thinking clearly, would just be like, ah, yes, this is a terrible situation. I should run now. And then Dr. Watson simply does not. But the, ah, yes, and now I'm going to tell you all of the worst things about me and be completely upfront about it. Just, I have so many things to say about that scene in all of its adaptations that if I say all of those words, I will never get to reading. Chapter 1, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. In the year 1878, I took my degree of Doctor of Medicine of the University of London and proceeded to Netley to go through the course prescribed for surgeons in the army. Having completed my studies there, I was duly attached to the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers as assistant surgeon. The regiment was stationed in India at the time, and before I could join it, the Second Afghan War had broken out. On landing at Bombay, I learned that my corps had advanced through the passes and was already deep in the enemy's country. I followed, however, with many other officers who were in the same situation as myself, and succeeded in reaching Kandahar in safety, where I found my regiment and at once entered upon my new duties. The campaign brought honors and promotion to many, but for me it had nothing but misfortune and disaster. I was removed from my brigade and attached to the Berkshires, with whom I served the fatal battle of Maiwand. There I was struck on the shoulder by a Jezail bullet, which shattered the bone and grazed the subclavian artery. I should have fallen into the hands of the murderous pronunciation. Question. We're going to go with Gaziz. Taking that sentence back. Great. I just went on a rant about how the thing that stops me from doing an annual read of Les Mis is the fact that I don't have a good grasp of pronouncing things in French. I did forget that there are many words of origin that don't follow clear English pronunciation rules. Had it not been for the devotion and courage shown by Murray, my orderly, who threw me across a pack horse and succeeded in bringing me safely to the British lines. Worn with pain and weak from the prolonged hardships which I had undergone, I was removed, with a great train of wounded sufferers, to the base hospital at Peshawar, where I rallied and had already improved so far as to be able to walk about the wards, and even to bask a little upon the veranda, when I was struck down by enteric fever, that curse of our Indian possessions. For months my life was despaired of, and when I at last came to myself and became convalescent, I was so weak and emaciated that a medical board determined that not a day should be lost in sending me back to England. I was dispatched accordingly in the troopship Orontes, taking me back to England, and landed a month later on Portsmouth Jetty, my health irretrievably ruined, but with permission from a paternal government to spend the next 9 months in attempting to improve it. I had neither kith nor kin in England, and was therefore as free as air, or as free as an income of 11 shillings and sixpence a day will permit a man to be. Under such circumstances, I naturally gravitated to London, that great cesspool to which all the loungers and idlers of the empire are irresistibly drained. There I stayed for some time at a private hotel in the Strand, leading a comfortless, meaningless existence, and spending such money as I had, considerably more freely than I ought. So alarming did the state of my finances become that I soon realized that I must either leave the metropolis and ruticate somewhere in the country, or that I must make a complete alteration in my style of living. Choosing the latter alternative, I began making up my mind to leave the hotel and take up my quarters in some less pretentious and less expensive domicile. On the very day that I had come to this conclusion, I was standing at the Criterion bar when someone tapped me on the shoulder, and turning around, I recognized young Stamford, who had been a dresser under me at Bart's. The sight of a friendly face in the great wilderness of London is a pleasant thing indeed to a lonely man. In old days, Stamford had never been a particular crony of mine, but now I hailed him with enthusiasm, and he, in his turn, appeared to be delighted to see me. In the exuberance of my joy, I asked him to lunch with me at Holborn, and we started off together in a hansom. "Whatever have you been doing with yourself, Watson?" he asked in an undisguised wonder. As we rattled through the crowded London streets, "You are as thin as a lath and as brown as a nut." I gave him a short sketch of my adventures, and had hardly concluded it by the time that we reached our destination. "Poor devil," he said, commiseratingly, after he had listened to my misfortunes. What are you up to now? Looking for lodgings, I answered, trying to solve the problem as to whether it is possible to get comfortable rooms at a reasonable price. That's a strange thing, remarked my companion. You are the second man today who has used that expression to me. And who was the first? I asked. A fellow who was working at the chemical laboratory up at the hospital. He was bemoaning himself this morning because he could not get someone to go halves with him in some nice rooms which he had found, which were too much for his purse. By Jove, I cried, if he really wants someone to share the rooms and the expense, I am the very man for him. I should prefer having a partner to being alone. Young Stamford looked rather strangely at me over his wine-glass. You don't know Sherlock Holmes yet, he said. Perhaps you would not care for him as a constant companion. Why? What is there against him? Oh, I didn't say there was anything against him. He's a little queer in his ideas, an enthusiast in some branches of science. As far as I know, he's a decent fellow enough. A medical student, I suppose? Said I. No, I have no idea what he intends to go in for. I believe he is well up in anatomy, as he is a first-class chemist, but as far as I know, he has never taken out any systematic medical classes. His studies are very desultory and eccentric, but he has amassed a lot of out-of-the-way knowledge which would astonish his professors. Did you never ask him what he was going in for? I asked. No, he's not a man that is easy to draw out, though he can be communicative enough when the fancy seizes him. I should like to meet him, I said. If I am to lodge with anyone, I should prefer a man of studious and quiet habits. I'm not strong enough yet to stand much noise or excitement. I had enough of both in Afghanistan to last me for the remainder of my natural existence. How could I meet this friend of yours? He's sure to be at the laboratory, returned my companion. He either avoids the place for weeks, or else he works there from morning till night. If you like, we'll drive around together after lunch. Certainly, I answered, and the conversation drifted away into other channels. Me, a few more particulars about the gentleman who I had proposed to take as a fellow lodger. You mustn't blame me if you don't get on with him, he said. I know nothing more of him than I have learned from meeting him occasionally in the laboratory. You proposed this arrangement, so you must not hold me responsible. If we don't get on, it'll be easy to part company, I answered. It seems to me, Stamford, I added, looking hard at my companion, that you have some reason for washing your hands of the matter. Is this fellow's temper so formidable, or what is it? Don't be mealy-mouthed about it. It is not easy to express the inexpressible, he answered with a laugh. Holmes is a little too scientific for my tastes. It approaches to cold-bloodedness. I could imagine his giving a friend a little pinch of the latest vegetable alkaloid, not out of malevolence, you understand, but simply out of a spirit of inquiry in order to have an accurate idea of the effects. To do him justice, I think he would take it himself with the same readiness. He appears to have a passion for definite and exact knowledge. Very right, too. Yes, but it may be pushed to excess. When it comes to beating the subjects in the dissecting room with a stick, it is certainly taking rather a bizarre shape. Beating the subjects? Yes, to verify how far bruises may be produced after death. I saw him at it with my own eyes. And yet you say he is not a medical student. No, heaven knows what the objects of his studies are, but here we are, and you must form your own impressions about him. As he spoke, we turned down a narrow lane and passed through a small side door, which opened into a wing of the great hospital. It was familiar ground to me, and I needed no guiding as we ascended the bleak stone staircase and made our way down the long corridor with its vista of whitewashed wall and dun-colored doors. Near the farther end, a low arched passage branched away from it and led to the chemical laboratory. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps with their blue flickering flames. There was only one student in the room, who was bending over a distant table absorbed in his work. At the sound of our steps, he glanced round and sprang to his feet with a cry of pleasure. "I've found it! I've found it!" he shouted to my companion, running towards us with a test tube in his hand. "I have found a reagent which is precipitated by hemoglobin and by nothing else." Had he discovered a gold mine, greater delight could not have shone upon his features. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Stamford, introducing us. "How are you?" he said cordially, gripping my hand with a strength for which I should hardly have given him credit. "You've been in Afghanistan, I perceive." "How on earth did you know that?" I asked in astonishment. "Never mind," he said, chuckling to himself. "The question now is about hemoglobin. No doubt you see the significance of this discovery of mine." "It is interesting chemically, no doubt," I answered, "but practically, why, man, it is the most practical medico-legal discovery for years. Don't you see that it gives us an infallible test for the blood stains? Come over here now." He seized me by the coat sleeve in his eagerness and drew me over to the table at which he had already been working. "Let us have some fresh blood," he said, digging a long bodkin into his finger and drawing off the resounding drop of blood in a chemical pipette. "Now, I add this small quantity of blood to a liter of water. You perceive that the resulting mixture has the appearance of pure water. The proportion of blood can't be more than 1 in 1,000,000. I have no doubt, however, that we shall be able to obtain the characteristic reaction." As he spoke, he threw into the vessel a few white crystals and then added some drops of a transparent fluid. In an instant, the contents assumed a dull mahogany color, and a brownish dust was precipitated to the bottom of the glass jar. "Ah!" he cried, clapping his hands and looking delighted as a child with a new toy. "What do you think of that?" "It seems to be a very delicate test," I remarked. "Beautiful, beautiful! The old Guasanium test was clumsy and uncertain. So is the microscopic examination for blood corpuscles. The latter is valueless if the stains are a few hours old. Now, this appears to act as well whether the blood is old or new. Had this test been invented, there are hundreds of men now walking the earth who would long ago have paid the penalty of their crimes." "Indeed," I murmured. "Criminal cases are continually hinging upon that one point. A man is suspected of a crime months, perhaps, after it has been committed. His linen or clothes are examined and brownish stains discovered upon them. Are they blood stains, or mud stains, or rust stains, or fruit stains, or what are they? That is a question which has puzzled many an expert. And why? Because there was no reliable test. Now we have the Sherlock Holmes test, and there will no longer be any difficulty." His eyes fairly glittered as he spoke, and he put his hand over his heart and bowed as if to some applauding crowd conjured up by his imagination. "You are to be congratulated," I remarked, considerably surprised at his enthusiasm. "There was a case of von Bischoff at Frankfurt last year. He would certainly have been hung had this test been in existence. Then there was Mason of Bradford, the notorious Muller, and Levere of Montpellier, and Sampson of New Orleans. I could name a score of cases in which it would have been decisive." "You seem a walking calendar of crime," said Stamford with a laugh. "You might start a paper on those lines. Call it Police News of the Past." "Very interesting reading it might be made, too," remarked Sherlock Holmes, sticking a small piece of plaster over the prick on his finger. "I have to be careful," he continued, turning to me with a smile, "for I dabble with poisons a good deal." He held out his hand as he spoke, and I noticed that it was mottled all over with similar pieces of plaster and discolored with strong acids. "We came here on business," said Stamford, sitting down on a three-legged stool and pushing another one in my direction with his foot. "My friend here wants to take diggings, and as you were complaining that you could get no one to go halves with you, I thought that I had better bring you together." Sherlock Holmes seemed delighted at the idea of sharing rooms with me. "I have my eye on a suite in Baker Street," he said, "which would suit us down to the ground. You don't mind the strong smell, the Oh, sorry. Yes. um, what was I? I did a bad job of saying words in the order they're written. I have my eye on a suite in Baker Street, he said, which would suit us down to the ground. You don't mind the smell of strong tobacco, I hope. I always smoke ships myself, I answered. That's good enough. I generally have chemicals about and occasionally do experiments. Would that annoy you? By no means. Let me see, what are my other shortcomings? I get in the dumps at times and don't open my mouth for days on end. You must not think I'm sulky when I do that. Just leave me alone, I'll soon be right. What have you to confess now? It's just as well for two fellows to know the worst of one another before they begin to live together. I laughed at this cross-examination. I keep a bullpup, I said, and I object to rows because my nerves are shaken, and I get up at all sorts of ungodly hours, and I am extremely lazy. I have another set of vices when I'm well, but those are the principal ones at present. Do you include violin playing in your category of rows? He asked anxiously. It depends on the player, I answered. A well-played violin is a treat for the gods. A badly played one. Oh, that's all right, he cried with a merry laugh. I think we may consider the thing is settled. That is, if the rooms are agreeable to you. When shall we see them? Call for me here at noon tomorrow, and we'll go together and settle everything, he answered. All right, noon exactly, said I, shaking his hand. We left him working among his chemicals, and we walked together towards my hotel. By the way, I asked suddenly, stopping and turning upon Stamford, how the deuce did he know that I had come from Afghanistan? My companion smiled an enigmatical smile. That's just his little peculiarity, he said. A good many people have wanted to know how he finds things out. Oh, a mystery, is it? I cried, rubbing my hands. This is very piquant. I am much obliged to you for bringing us together. The proper study of mankind is man, you know. You must study him, then, Stamford said, and he bade me good-bye. You'll find him a knotty problem, though. I'll wager he learns more about you than you about him. Goodbye. Goodbye, I answered, and strolled on to my hotel, considerably interested in my new acquaintance. I am taking a water break. Okay. Chapter 2. The Science of Deduction. We met the next day as he had arranged, and inspected the rooms at number 221B Baker Street, of which he had spoken at our meeting. They consisted of a couple of comfortable bedrooms and a single, large, airy sitting room, cheerfully furnished and illuminated by two broad windows. So desirable in every way were the apartments, and so moderate did the terms seem when divided between us, that the bargain was concluded upon the spot, and we at once entered into possession. That very evening I moved my things round from the hotel, and on the following morning Sherlock Holmes followed me with several boxes and portmanteaus. For a day or two we were busily employed in unpacking and laying out our property to the best advantage. That done, we gradually began to settle down and accommodate ourselves to our new surroundings. Holmes was certainly not a difficult man to live with. He was quiet in his ways, and his habits were regular. It was rare for him to be up after 10 at night, and he had invariably breakfasted and gone out before I rose in the morning. Sometimes he spent his day at the chemical laboratory, and sometimes in the dissecting rooms, and occasionally in long walks which appeared to take him to the lowest portions of the city. Nothing could exceed his energy when the working fit was upon him, but now and again a reaction would seize him, and for days on end he would lie upon the sofa in the sitting room, hardly uttering a word or moving a muscle from morning to night. On these occasions I have noticed such a dreamy, vacant expression in his eyes that I might have suspected him of being addicted to the use of some narcotic had not the temperance and cleanliness of his whole life forbidden such a notion. As the weeks went by, my interest in him and my curiosity as to his aims in life gradually deepened and increased. His very person and appearance were such as to strike the attention of the most casual observer. In height, he was rather over 6 feet, and so excessively lean that he seemed to be considerably taller. His eyes were sharp and piercing, save during those intervals of torpor which I have alluded, and his thin, hawk-like nose gave his whole expression an air of alertness and decision. His chin, too, had the prominence and squareness which mark the man of determination. His hands were invariably blotted with ink and stained with chemicals, yet he was possessed of extraordinary delicacy of touch, as I frequently had occasion to observe when I watched him manipulating his fragile philosophical instruments. The reader may set me down as a hopeless busybody when I confess how much this man stimulated my curiosity, and how often I endeavored to break through the reticence which he showed on all that concerned himself. Before pronouncing judgment, however, be it remembered how objectless was my life, and how little there was to engage my attention. My health forbade me from venturing out unless the weather was exceptionally genial, and I had no friends who would call upon me and break the monotony of my daily existence. Under these circumstances, I eagerly hailed the little mystery which hung around my companion, and spent much of my time in endeavoring to unravel it. He was not studying medicine. He had himself, in reply to a question, confirmed Stamford's opinion in that point. Neither did he appear to have pursued any course of reading which might fit him for a degree in science, or any other recognized portal which would give him an entrance into the learned world. Yet his zeal for certain studies was remarkable, and within eccentric limits his knowledge was so extraordinarily ample and minute that his observations have fairly astounded me. Surely no man would work so hard or attain such precise information unless he had some definite end in view. Desultory readers are seldom remarkable for the exactness of their learning. No man burdens his mind with small matters unless he has some very good reason for doing so. His ignorance was as remarkable as his knowledge. Of contemporary literature, philosophy, and politics he appeared to know next to nothing. Upon my quoting Thomas Carlyle, he inquired in the naivest way who he might be and what he had done. My surprise reached a climax, however, when I found incidentally that he was ignorant of the Copernican theory of the composition of the solar system. That any civilized human being in this 19th century should not be aware that the earth traveled around the sun appeared to me to be such an extraordinary fact that I could hardly realize it. "You appear to be astonished," he said, smiling at my expression of surprise. "Now that I do know it, I shall do my best to forget it." "To forget it?" "You see," he explained, "I consider that a man's brain originally is like a little empty attic, and you have to stock it with such furniture as you choose. A fool takes in all the lumber of every sort that he comes across, so that the knowledge which might be useful to him gets crowded out, or at best is jumbled up with a lot of other things, so that he has a difficulty in laying his hands upon it. Now, the skillful workman is very careful indeed as to what he takes into his brain attic. He will have nothing but the tools which may help him in doing his work, but of these things he has a large assortment, and all in the most perfect order. It is a mistake to think that the little room has elastic walls and can distend to any extent. Depend upon it, there comes a time for when every addition of knowledge you forget something that you knew before. It is of the highest importance, therefore, not to have useless facts elbowing out the useful ones." "But the solar system!" I protested. "What the deuce is it to me?" he interrupted impatiently. "You say that we go round the sun. If we went around the moon, it would not make a pennyworth of difference to me or to my work." I was on the point of asking him what that work might be, but something in his manner showed me that the question would be an unwelcome one. I pondered over our short conversation, however, and endeavored to draw my deductions from it. He said that he would acquire no knowledge which did not bear upon his object. Therefore, all the knowledge which he possessed was such as would be useful to him. I enumerated in my own mind all the various points upon which he had shown me that he was exceptionally well informed. I even took a pencil and jotted them down. I could not help smiling at the document when I had completed it. It ran in this way: Sherlock Holmes, his limits. Knowledge of literature, nil. Knowledge of philosophy, nil. Knowledge of astronomy, nil. Knowledge of politics, feeble. Knowledge of botany, variable. Well up in belladonna, opium, and poisons generally, knows nothing of practical gardening. Knowledge of geology, practical but limited, tells at a glance different soils from each other. After walks has shown me splashes upon his trousers and told me by their color and constance in which part of consistence. After walks has shown me splashes upon his trousers and told me by their color and consistence in what part of London he had received them. Knowledge of chemistry, profound. Knowledge of anatomy, accurate but unsystematic. knowledge of sensational literature immense. He appears to know every detail of every horror perpetuated in the century. Plays the violin well. Is an expert single stick player, boxer, and swordsman. Has a good practical knowledge of British law. When I had got so far in my list, I threw it into the fire in despair. If I can only find what the fellow is driving at by reconciling all these accomplishments and discovering a calling which needs them all, I said to myself, I may as well give up the attempt at once. I see that I have alluded above to his powers upon the violin. These were very remarkable, but as eccentric as all his other accomplishments. That he could play pieces, and difficult pieces I knew well, because at my request he has played me some of Mendelssohn's Lieder and other favorites. When left to himself, however, he would seldom produce any music or attempt any recognized air. Leaning back in his armchair of an evening, he would close his eyes and scrape carelessly at the fiddle which was thrown across his knee. Sometimes the chords were sonorous and melancholy. Occasionally they were fantastic and cheerful. Clearly they reflected the thoughts which possessed him, but whether the music aided those thoughts or whether the playing was simply the result of a whim or fancy was more than I could determine. I might have rebelled against these exasperating solos had it not been that he usually terminated them by playing in quick succession a whole series of my favorite airs as a slight compensation for the trial upon my patience. During the first week or so, we had no callers, and I had begun to think that my companion was as friendless a man as I was myself. Presently, however, I found that he had many acquaintances, and those in the most different classes of society. There was one sallow, rat-faced, dark-eyed fellow who was introduced to me as Mr. Lestrade, who came 3 or 4 times in a single week. One morning, a young girl called, fashionably dressed, and stayed for half an hour or more. Yeah. The previous 10 seconds of me trying to decide if this sentence is of harmful intent. We're gonna go with yes and skip it. It's not bad. I just don't have. Oh, yeah, we're gonna redact that one out of an abundance of caution. On another occasion, an old white-haired gentleman had an interview with my companion, and on another, a railway porter in his velveteen uniform. When any of these nondescript individuals put in an appearance, Sherlock Holmes used to beg for the use of the sitting room, and I would retire to my bedroom. He always apologized to me for putting me to this inconvenience. I have to use this room as a place of business, he said, and these people are my clients. Again, I had an opportunity of asking him a point-blank question, and again, my delicacy prevented me from forcing another man to confide in me. I imagined at the time that he had some strong reason for not alluding to it, but he soon dispelled the idea by coming round to the subject of his own accord. It was upon the 4th of March, as I have good reason to remember, that I rose somewhat earlier than usual and found that Sherlock Holmes had not yet finished his breakfast. The landlady had become so accustomed to my late habits that my place had not been laid nor my coffee prepared. With the unreasonable petulance of mankind, I rang the bell and gave a curt intimation that I was ready. Then I picked up a magazine from the table and attempted to while away the time with it while my companion munched silently at his toast. One of the articles had a pencil mark at the heading, and I naturally began to run my eye through it. Its somewhat ambitious title was The Book of Life, and it attempted to show how much an observant man might learn by accurate and systematic examination of all that came in his way. It struck me as being a remarkable mixture of shrewdness and of absurdity. The reasoning was close and intense, but the deductions appeared to me to be far-fetched and exaggerated. The writer claimed by a momentary expression, a twitch of a muscle, or a glance of an eye, to fathom a man's inmost thoughts. Deceit, according to him, was an impossibility in the case of one trained to observation and analysis. His conclusions were as infallible as so many propositions of Euclid. So startling would his results appear to the uninitiated that until they learned the process by which he had arrived at them, they might as well consider him a necromancer. From a drop of water, said the writer, a logician could infer the possibility of an Atlantic or a Niagara without having seen or heard of one or the other. So all life is a great chain, the nature of which is known whenever we are shown a single link of it. Like all other arts, the science of deduction and analysis is one which can only be acquired by long and patient study, nor is life long enough to allow any mortal to attain the highest possible perfection in it. Before turning to those mortal and mental aspects of the matter which prevent the greatest difficulties, let the inquirer begin by more el- let the inquirer begin by mastering more elementary problems. Let him, on meeting a fellow mortal, learn at a glance to distinguish the history of the man, and the trade or profession to which he belongs. Puerile as such an exercise may seem, it sharpens the faculties of observation, and teaches one where to look and what to look for. By a man's fingernails, by his coat sleeve, by his boots, by his trouser knees, by the callosities of his forefinger and thumb, by his expression, by his shirt cuffs, by each of these things a man calling is plainly revealed. That all united should fail to enlighten the competent inquirer is any case almost inconceivable. What ineffable twaddle, I cried, slapping the magazine down on the table. I never read such rubbish in my life. What is it? Asked Sherlock Holmes. Why, this article, I said, pointing at it with my egg spoon as I sat down to my breakfast. I see that you have read it since you have marked it. I don't deny that it is smartly written. It irritates me, though. It is evidently the theory of some armchair lounger who evolves all these neat little paradoxes in the seclusion of his own study. It is not practical. I should like to see him clapped down in a third-class carriage on the Underground and asked to give the trades of all his fellow travelers. I would lay 1,000 to 1 against him. You would lose your money, Holmes remarked calmly. As for the article, I wrote it myself. You? Yes, I have a turn both for observation and for deduction. The theories which I have expressed there, and which appear to you to be so chimerical, are really extremely practical. So practical that I depend upon them for my bread and cheese. And how? I asked involuntarily. Well, I have a trade of my own. I suppose I am the only one in the world. I am a consulting detective, if you can understand what that is. Here in London we have lots of government detectives and lots of private ones. When the fellows are at fault, they come to me, and I manage to put them on the right scent. They lay all the evidence before me, and I am generally able, by the help of my knowledge of the history of crime, to set the They lay all the evidence before me, and I am generally able, by the help of my knowledge of the history of crime, to set them straight. There's a strong family resemblance about misdeeds, and if you have all the details of 1,000 at your finger ends, it's odd if you can't unravel the 1,001st. Lestrade is a well-known detective. He's got himself into a fog recently over a forgery case, and that was what brought him here. And these other people? They're mostly sent on by private inquiry agencies. They are all people who are in trouble about something and want a little enlightening. I listen to their story, and they listen to my comments, and then I pocket my fee. But do you mean to say, I said, that without leaving your room you can unravel some knot which other men can make nothing of, though they have seen every detail for themselves? Quite so. I have a kind of intuition that way. Now and again a case turns up which is a little more complex. Then I have to bustle about and see things with my own eyes. You see, I have a lot of special knowledge which I apply to the problem and which facilitates matters wonderfully. Those rules of deduction laid down in that article which aroused your scorn are invaluable to me in practical work. Observation with me is second nature. You appeared to be surprised when I told you on our first meeting that you had come from Afghanistan. You were told, no doubt? Nothing of the sort. I knew you came from Afghanistan. From long habit, the train of thoughts ran so swiftly through my mind that I arrived at the conclusion without being conscious of intermediate steps. There were such steps, however. The train of reasoning ran, here is a gentleman of a medical type, but with the air of a military man. Clearly an army doctor, then. He's just come from the tropics, for his face is dark, and that is not the natural tint of his skin, for his wrists are fair. He has undergone hardship and sickness, as his haggard face says clearly. His left arm has been injured. He holds it in a stiff and unnatural manner. Where in the tropics could an English army doctor have seen much hardship and got his arm wounded? Clearly in Afghanistan. The whole train of thought didn't occupy a second. Then I remarked that you came from Afghanistan, and you were astonished. It is simple enough as you explain it, I said, smiling. You remind me of Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin. I had no idea that such individuals exist outside of stories. Sherlock Holmes rose and lit his pipe. No doubt you think you are complimenting me and comparing me to Dupin, he observed. Now, in my opinion, Dupin is a very inferior fellow. That trick of his, breaking in on friends' thoughts with an apropos remark after a quarter of an hour's silence, is really very showy and superficial. He had some analytical genius, no doubt, but he was by no means such a phenomenon as Poe appeared to imagine. Have you read Gabreau's works? I said. Does Lecoq come up to your idea of a detective? Sherlock Holmes sniffed sardonically. Lecoq was a miserable bungler, he said in an angry voice. He had only one thing to recommend him, and that was his energy. That book made me positively ill. The question was how to identify an unknown prisoner. I could have done it in 24 hours. Lecoq took 6 months or so. It might be made a textbook for detectives to teach them what to avoid. I felt rather indignant at having two characters whom I had admired treated in this cavalier style. I walked over to the window and stood looking out into the busy street. This fellow may be clever, I said to myself, but he is certainly very conceited. There are no crimes and no criminals in these days, he said querulously. What is the use of having brains in our profession? I know well that I have it in me to make my name famous. No man lives or has ever lived who has brought the same amount of study and natural talent to the detection of crime which I have done. And what is the result? There is no crime to detect. Or at most, some bungling villainy with a motive so transparent that even a Scotland Yard official can see through it. I was still annoyed at his bumptious style of conversation. I thought it best to change the topic. I wonder what that fellow is looking for, I asked, pointing to a stalwart, plainly dressed individual who was walking slowly down the other side of the street, looking anxiously at the numbers. He had a large blue envelope in his hand and was evidently the bearer of a message. You mean the retired sergeant of marines, said Sherlock Holmes. Brag and bounce, I thought to myself. He knows that I can't verify his guess. The thought had hardly passed through my mind when the man whom we were watching caught sight of the number on our door and ran rapidly across the roadway. We heard a loud knock, a deep voice below, and heavy steps ascending the stair. For Mr. Sherlock Holmes, he said, stepping into the room and handing my friend the letter. Here was an opportunity of taking the conceit out of him. He little thought of this when he made that random shot. May I ask, my lad, I said in the blandest of voice, what your trade may be? Commissionaire, sir, he said, gruffly. Uniform away for repairs. And you were? I asked, with a slightly malicious glance to my companion. A sergeant, sir. Royal Marine Light Infantry, sir. No answer? Right, sir. He clicked his heels together, raised his hand in salute, and was gone. I think maybe one more chapter. I say suspiciously, looking how many pages long it is. Oh, a lot. Wait, hang on. That was 5. So that was 2 chapters. Where does this one end? Yeah, well, yeah. I need a better light source behind it because I am very front lit, which is good for the camera, but bad for the seeing. Okay. Chapter 3, The Lauriston Garden Mystery. I confess that I was considerably startled by this fresh proof of the practical nature of my companion's theories. My respect for his powers of analysis increased wondrously. There still remained some lurking suspicion in my mind, however, that the whole thing was a prearranged episode intended to dazzle me, though what earthly object could he have in taking me in what was... Though what earthly object he could have in taking me in what? Though what earthly object he could have in taking me in was past my comprehension. When I looked at him, he had finished reading the note, and his eyes had assumed the vacant, lackluster expression with which showed mental abstraction. "How in the world did you deduce that?" I asked. "Deduce what?" he said petulantly. "Why, that he was a retired sergeant of Marines." "I have no time for trifles," he answered brusquely, then with a smile, "Excuse my rudeness, you broke the thread of my thoughts, but perhaps it is as well. So, you actually were not able to see that that man was a sergeant of Marines?" "No, indeed." "It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. Even across the street I could see a great blue anchor tattooed on the back of the fellow's hand. That smacked of the sea. He had a military carriage, however, and regulation side whiskers. There we have the Marine. He was a man with some amount of self-importance and a certain air of command. You must have observed the way in which he held his head and swung his cane. A steady, respectable, middle-aged man, too, on the face of him. All facts which led me to believe he had been a sergeant." "Wonderful!" I ejaculated. "Commonplace," said Holmes, though I thought from his expression that he was pleased at my evident surprise and admiration. "I said just now that there were no criminals. It appears I'm wrong. Look at this." He threw me over the note which the commissionaire had brought. "Why," I cried as I cast my eye over it, "this is terrible." "It does seem to be a little out of the common," he remarked calmly. "Would you mind reading it to me aloud?" This is the This is the letter which I read to him. "My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, there has been a bad business during the night at 3 Lauriston Gardens off the Brixton Road. Our man on the beat saw a light there about 2 in the morning, and as the house was an empty one, suspected that something was amiss. He found the door open, and in the front room, which is bare of furniture, discovered the body of a gentleman, well dressed and having cards in his pocket bearing the name of Enoch J. Drebber, Cleveland, Ohio, USA. There had been no robbery, nor is there any evidence as to how the man met his death. There were marks of blood in the room, but there is no wound upon his person. We are at a loss as to how he came into the empty house. Indeed, the whole affair is a puzzler. If you can come round to the house at any time before 12, you will find me there. I have left everything in statu quo until I hear from you. If you are unable to come, I shall give you fuller details, and would esteem it a great kindness if you would favor me with your opinions. Yours faithfully, Tobias Gregson." "Gregson is the smartest of the Scotland Yarders," my friend remarked. "He and Lestrade are the pick of a bad lot. They are both quick and energetic, but conventional, shockingly so. They have their knives into one another, too. They are as jealous a pair of professional beauties. There will be some fun over this case if they are both put upon the scent." I was amazed at the calm way in which he rippled on. "Surely there is not a moment to be lost," I cried. "Shall I go and order you a cab?" "I'm not sure about whether I shall go. I am the most incurably lazy devil that ever stood in shoe leather, that is. When the fit is on me, I can be spry enough at times." "Why, it is just such a chance as you have been longing for." "My dear fellow, what does that matter to me? Supposing I unravel the whole matter, you may be sure that Gregson, Lestrade, and Co. will pocket all the credit. That comes of being an unofficial personage." "But he begs you to help him." "Yes, He knows that I am his superior and acknowledges it to me, but he would cut his tongue out before he would own it to any third person. However, we may as well go and have a look. I shall work it out on my own hook. I may have a laugh at them if nothing else. Come on. He hustled on his overcoat and bustled about in a way that showed that an energetic fit had superseded the apathetic one. Get your hat, he said. You wish me to come? Yes, if you have nothing better to do. A minute later, we were both in a hansom driving furiously for Brixton Road. It was a foggy, cloudy morning, and the it was a foggy, cloudy morning, and a dun covered It was a foggy, cloudy morning, and a dun-colored veil hung over the housetops, looking like the reflection of the mud-colored streets beneath. My companion was looking like nope. Okay. In my defense, the book, this is the tiniest font ever, and I have been saying words out loud for nearly a continuous hour. Okay. My companion was in the best of spirits, and prattled away about Cremona fiddles and the difference between a Stradivarius and a Amati. As for myself, I was silent, for the dull weather and the melancholy business upon which we were engaged depressed my spirits. You don't seem to give much thought to the matter at hand, I said at last, interrupting Holmes' musical disquisition. No data yet, he answered. It is a capital mistake to theorize before you have all the evidence. It biases the judgment. You will have your data soon, I remarked, pointing my finger. This is the Brixton Road, and that is the house, if I'm not very much mistaken. So it is. Stop, driver, stop! We were still 100 yards or so from it, but he insisted upon our alighting, and we finished our journey on foot. Number 3, Lauriston Gardens, wore an ill-omened and minatory look. It was one of 4 which stood back some little way from the street, 2 being occupied and 2 empty. The latter looked out with 3 tiers of vacant, melancholy windows, which were blank and dreary, save that here and there a to-let card had developed like a cataract upon the bleared panes. A small garden sprinkled over with a scattered eruption of sickly plants separated each of these houses from the street, and was traversed by a narrow pathway, yellowish and Yes, the shirt does. This shirt does have a boob window, or rather lack of boob window. I got so distracted con crunching that I missed the 2-year anniversary of my own top surgery. Again, I was gonna make silly Instagram content, except I forgot. That was like last week, I say as I look at my wrist, which isn't even the wrist I would wear a watch on. I appear to have reached the limits of my brain for the day. Yes. Thank you. Um oh Lord. Where was I? See, there was a moment when I said public domain book club hour where I thought, oh, but an hour seems like such a short amount of time to do a thing for. And then I remembered, oh, hey, you haven't said words continuously without, like, getting distracted for a whole hour in so long. Hour is an ambitious length of time to focus and concentrate and read the tiniest font on earth while pointed away from the light source. Um. Where were. I am going to finish this chapter. No, I am not. Yes, I am. We're gonna finish this chapter. Oh, whoa. You are doing a spam. How do I kill? You are doing a spam. I also don't know how to kill that man. Yes. No, I would like to do the opposite of pin that message. I would like to goodbye that message. We are learning today. I would like to do the opposite of pin that message, actually. Can I do the opposite of kill? Ah! I don't know which one is right click, apparently. Bonk. Dot, dot, dot. Chat settings. Yes. I am learning things today. Manage suspicious user. Cool. I have, yes. Restricted. Great. Number 3, Lauriston Gardens, wore an ill-omened and minatory look. It was one of 4 which stood back some little way from the street, 2 being occupied and 2 empty. The latter looked out with 3 tiers of vacant, melancholy windows, which were blank and dreary, save that here and there a to let card had developed like a cataract upon the bleared panes. A small garden sprinkled over with a scattered eruption of sickly plants separated each of these houses from the street, and was traversed by a narrow pathway, yellowish in color, and consisting apparently of a mixture of clay and gravel. The whole place was very sloppy from the rain which had fallen through the night. The garden was bounded by a 3-foot brick wall with a fringe of wood rails upon the top, and against the wall was leaning a stalwart police constable, surrounded by a small knot of loafers who craned their necks and strained their eyes in the vain hope of catching some glimpse of the proceedings within. I had imagined that Sherlock Holmes would at once have hurried into the house and plunged into a study of the mystery. Nothing appeared to be further from his intention. With an air of nonchalance, which, under the circumstances, seemed to me to border upon affection, he lounged up and down the pavement and gazed vacantly at the ground, the sky, the opposite houses, and the line of railings. Having finished his scrutiny, he proceeded slowly down the path, or rather down the fringe of the fringe of grass which flanked the path, keeping his eyes riveted upon the ground. Twice he stopped, and once I saw him smile and heard him utter an exclamation of satisfaction. There were many marks of footsteps upon the wet, clayey soil, but since the police had been coming and going over it, I was unable to see how my companion could hope to learn anything from it. Still, I had such extraordinary evidence of the quickness of his perceptive faculties that I had no doubt that he could see a great deal which was hidden from me. At the door of the house, we were met by a tall, white-faced, flaxen-haired man with a notebook in his hand, who rushed forward and wrung my companion's hand with effusion. "It is indeed kind of you to come," he said. "I have had everything left untouched." "Except that," my friend answered, pointing at the pathway. If a herd of buffaloes had passed along, there could not be a greater mess. No doubt, however, that you had drawn your own conclusions, Gregson, before you permitted this. I've had so much to do inside the house, the detective said evasively. My colleague, Mr. Lestrade, is here. I had relied upon him to look after this. Holmes glanced at me and raised his eyebrows sardonically. With two such men as yourself and Lestrade upon the ground, there will not be much for a third party to figure out. Gregson rubbed his hands in a self-satisfied way. I think we have done all that can be done, he answered. It's a queer case, though, and I know your taste for such things. You did not come here in a cab? Asked Sherlock Holmes. No, sir. Nor Lestrade? No, sir. Then let us go and look at the room. With which inconsequent remark he strode on into the house, followed by Gregson, whose features expressed this astonishment. A short passage, bare-planked and dusty, led to the kitchen and offices. Two doors opened out of it, to the left and to the right. One of these had obviously been closed for many weeks. The other belonged to the dining room, which was the apartment in which the mysterious affair had occurred. Holmes walked in, and I followed him with that subdued feeling at my heart which the presence of death inspires. It was a large square room, looking all the larger from absence of furniture. A vulgar, flaring paper adorned the walls, but it was blotched in places with mildew, and here and there great strips had become detached and hung down, exposing the yellow plaster beneath. Opposite the door was a showy fireplace surmounted by a mantelpiece of imitation white marble. On one corner of this was stuck the stump of a red wax candle. The solitary window was so dirty that the light was hazy and uncertain, giving a dull gray tinge to everything, which was intensified by the thick layer of dust which coated the whole apartment. All these details I observed afterwards. At present my attention was centered upon the single, grim, motionless figure which lay stretched upon the boards, with vacant, sightless eyes staring up at the discolored ceiling. It was that of a man about 43 or 44 years of age, middle-sized, broad-shouldered, with crisp, curling black hair and a short, stubbly beard. He was dressed in a heavy broadcloth frock coat and waistcoat, with light-colored trousers and immaculate collar and cuffs. A top hat, well brushed and trim, was placed upon the floor beside him. His hands were clenched and his arms were thrown abroad, while his lower limbs were interlocked, as though his death struggle had been a grievous one. On his rigid face there stood an expression of horror, and as it seemed to me, hatred, such as I have never seen upon human features. This malignant and terrible contortion, combined with the low forehead, blunt nose, and prothagonous jaw, gave the dead man a singularly simious and ape-like appearance, which was increased by his writhing, unnatural posture. I have seen death in many forms, but never has it appeared to me in a more fearsome aspect than in that dark, grimy apartment, which looked out upon one of the main arteries of suburban London. Ah, yes. You probably should have mod powers. But also I should probably know how to do uh a non-zero amount of these things as well. Wow, I can spell. I can spell words so good. No, I can't spell words so good. Hey Twitch, can we have less pop-up things that try to tell me how to do the thing that I think I know how to do, but in a way that no human being could ever understand the instructions you're giving me? There we go! I need a different light source. That's not a helpful distance away. I cannot get a different light source. I had put them on restricted mode. I don't know what restricted mode does. But I did that. The thumbs up needs to go in the... I don't know either. It was just a button that came up while I right-clicked and left-clicked on things. Until there was a button that said restrict user, and I clicked that one. um and then there was something green that came up after that said this user will not be able to post messages or do something else that sounded like a bad idea. So I was like, okay, that feels correct. I don't know. Lestrade, lean and ferret-like as ever, was standing by the doorway and greeted my companion and myself. "This case will make a stir, sir," he remarked. "It beats anything I have ever seen, and I am no chicken." "There is no clue," said Gregson. "Not at all," chimed in Lestrade. Sherlock Holmes approached the body and, kneeling down, examined it intently. "You are sure that there is no wound?" he asked, pointing to numerous gouts and splashes of blood which lay all around. "Positive," cried both detectives. "Then, of course, this blood belongs to a second individual, presumably the murderer, if murder has been committed. It reminds me of the circumstances attendant on the death of Van Jansen in Utrecht in the year 34. Do you remember the case, Gregson?" "No, sir." "Read it up. You really should. There is nothing new under the sun. It has all been done before." As he spoke, his nimble fingers were flying here, there, and everywhere, feeling, pressing, unbuttoning, examining, while his eyes wore the same faraway expression which I have already remarked upon. So swiftly was the examination made that one would hardly have guessed the minuteness with which it was conducted. Finally, he sniffed the dead man's lips, and then glanced at the soles of his patent leather boots. "He has not been moved at all?" he asked. "No more than was necessary for the purpose of our examination." "You can take him to the mortuary now," he said. "There is nothing more to be learned." Gregson had a stretcher and 4 men at hand. At his call, they entered the room, and the stranger was lifted and carried out. As they raised him, a ring tinkled down and rolled across the floor. Lestrade grabbed it up and stared at it with mystified eyes. "There's been a woman here," he cried. "It's a woman's wedding ring." He held it out, as he spoke, upon the palm of his hand. We all gathered round him and gazed at it. There could be no doubt that this circlet of plain gold had once adorned the finger of a bride. "This complicates matters," said Gregson. "Heaven knows they were complicated enough before." "You sure it doesn't simplify them?" observed Holmes. "There is nothing to be learned by staring at it. What did you find in his pockets?" "We have it all here," said Gregson, pointing to a litter of objects upon one of the bottom steps of the stairs. "A gold watch, number 97,163, by Braunod of Oh, I tried so hard on the numbers. Yes. I tried so hard on the numbers and then failed to say London. Okay. A gold watch with a number I will not be repeating, by Barrod of London. Gold Albert chain, heavy and solid. Gold ring with Masonic device. Gold pin, bulldog's head with rubies as eyes. Russian leather card case with cards of Enoch J. Drebber of Cleveland, corresponding with the E.J.D. upon the linen. No purse, but loose money to the extent of £7.13. Pocket edition of Boccaccio's Decameron, with the name of Joseph Strangerson upon the flyleaf. 2 letters, one addressed to E.J. Drebber and one to Joseph Strangerson. Stangerson! At what address? American Exchange, Strand, to be left till called for. They are both from the Guion Steamship Company and refer to the sailing of their boats from Liverpool. It is clear that this unfortunate man was about to return to New York. Have you made any inquiries as to this man Stangerson? I did at once, sir, said Gregson. I have had advertisements sent to all the newspapers, and one of my men has gone to the American Exchange, but he has not returned yet. Have you sent to Cleveland? We telegraphed this morning. How did you word your inquiries? We simply detailed the circumstances and said that we should be glad of any information which could help us. You did not ask for particulars on any point which appeared to you to be crucial. I asked about Stangerson. Nothing else. Is there no circumstance on which this whole case appears to hinge? Will you not telegraph again? I have said all I have to say, said Gregson in an offended voice. Sherlock Holmes chuckled to himself and appeared to be about to make some remark when Lestrade, who had been in the front room while we were holding this conversation in the hall, reappeared upon the scene, rubbing his hands in a pompous and self-satisfied manner. Mr. Gregson, he said, I have just made a discovery of the highest importance, and one which will have been overlooked had I not made a careful examination of the walls. The little man's eyes sparkled as he spoke, and he was evidently in a state of suppressed exultation at having scored a point against his colleague. Come here, he said, bustling back into the room, the atmosphere of which felt clearer since the removal of its ghastly inmate. Now stand there. He struck a match on his boot and held it up against the wall. Look at that, he said triumphantly. I have remarked that the paper had fallen away in parts, and in this particular corner of the room a large piece had peeled off, leaving a yellow square of coarse plastering. Across this bare space there was, scrawled in blood-red letters, the single word, Rache. What do you think of that? Cried the detective, with the air of a showman exhibiting his show. This was overlooked because it was in the darkest corner of the room, and no one thought of looking there. The murderer had written it with his or her own blood. See this smear where it had trickled down the wall. That disposes of the idea of suicide anyhow. Why was that corner chosen to write it on? I'll tell you. See that candle on the mantelpiece? It was lit at the time, and if that was lit, this corner would be the brightest instead of the darkest portion of the wall. And what does it mean now that you have found it? Said Gregson in a desperatory. De- I hate it when words are split across two lines. Depreciatory. Voice. Mean? Why, it means that the writer was going to put the female name Rachel, but was disturbed before he or she had time to finish. You mark my words, when this case comes to be cleared up, you will find that a woman named Rachel has something to do with it. It is all very well for you to laugh, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You may be very smart and clever, but the old hound is the best, when all is said and done. I really beg your pardon, said my companion, who had ruffled the little man's temper by bursting into an explosion of laughter. You certainly have the credit of being the first to find this out, and, as you say, it bears every mark of having been written by the other participant in last night's mystery. I have not had time to examine this room yet, but with your permission I shall do so now. As he spoke, he whipped a tape measure and a large round magnifying glass from his pocket. With these two implements, he trotted noiselessly about the room, sometimes stopping, occasionally kneeling, and once lying flat upon his face. So engrossed was he with his occupation that he appeared to have forgotten our presence, for he chattered away to himself under his breath the whole time, keeping up a running fire of exclamations, groans, whistles, and little cries suggestive of encouragement and hope. As I watched him, I was irresistibly reminded of a pure-blooded, well-trained foxhound as it dashes backward and forward through the covert, whining in its eagerness, until it comes across the lost scent. For 20 minutes or more he continued his researches, measuring with the most exact care the distance between marks which were entirely invisible to me, and occasionally applying his tape to the walls in an equally incomprehensible manner. In one place he gathered up very carefully a little pile of gray dust from the floor and packed it away in an envelope. Finally he examined with his glass the word upon the wall, going over every letter of it with the most minute exactness. This done, he appeared to be satisfied, for he replaced his tape and glass in his pocket. I will say words about BBC Sherlock in exactly one page. Not even a page, I think. They say that genius is an infinite capacity for taking pains, he remarked with a smile. It is a very bad definition, but it does apply to detective work. Gregson and Lestrade had watched the maneuvers of their amateur companion with considerable curiosity and some contempt. They evidently failed to appreciate the fact, which I had begun to realize, that Sherlock Holmes' smallest actions were all directed towards some definite and practical end. What do you think of it, sir? They both asked. It would be robbing you of the credit of the case if I were to presume to help you, remarked my friend. You are doing so well now that it would be a pity for anyone to interfere. There was a word of sarcasm in his voice as he spoke. If you will let me know how your investigations go, he continued, I shall be happy to give you any help I can. In the meantime, I should like to speak to the constable who found the body. Can you give me his name and address? Lestrade glanced at his notebook. John Rance, he said. He's off duty now. You'll find him at 46 Audley Court, Kennington Park Gate. Holmes took note of the address. Come along, doctor, he said. We shall go look him up. I'll tell you one thing which may help you in the case, he continued, turning to the two detectives. There has been murder done, and the murderer was a man. He was more than 6 feet high, was in the prime of his life, had small feet for his height, wore coarse, square-toed boots, and smoked a trichinopoly cigar. It's always the word after the hard word that I fuck up terribly. Trichinopoly cigar. He came here with his victim in a four-wheeled cab which was drawn by a horse, with 3 old shoes and 1 new one on his off foreleg. In all probability, the murderer had a florid face, and the fingernails of his right hand were remarkably long. These are only a few indications, but they may assist you. Lestrade and Gregson glanced at each other with an incredulous smile. If this man was murdered, how was it done? Asked the former. Poison, said Sherlock Holmes curtly, and strode off. One other thing, Lestrade. He added, turning round at the door, Rache. It's the German for revenge, so don't lose your time looking for Miss Rachel. With which Parthian shot he walked away, leaving the two rivals open-mouthed behind him. And that brings us to the end of chapter 3, which is where I will be giving up for the evening as far as reading goes, because my eyes are done. Oh, absolutely. It is definitely I am using all of my brain power to figure out the hard word, and now I can't say the word cigar because I think it has an N in it. On BBC Sherlock. It's one of those things where it 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 did so much to our generation, and I respect it for that, but God, I it's one of those, would I suggest that anyone watch it first now? Probably not. I don't think it should be anyone's first adaptation of Sherlock Holmes now. hates its source material, hates its viewers. That's fair. That's fair. At the same time, I will say I feel like everyone fell off of BBC Sherlock after season 2. Yeah, it's one of those, like, it makes so much sense. Like, there are definitely, like, essays to be written on the I could phrase this as either cultural phenomenon or collective psychic damage to the chronically online of, like, our generation, done by, like, all of Super Wholock, except I feel like Doctor Who did less psychic damage than the other two, you know? Yeah. And that's why I have been so, like, I've been hello! That made a surprise big noise that I wasn't expecting. Hello and welcome to, the end of the end of Public Domain Book Club hour and a half. Um, I'm going to try to do this on a weekly basis. The only thing that Doctor Who did was make people be attracted to David Tennant, which isn't bad. Yeah, that's an objectively, like, correct answer. David Tennant is great. Um, yeah. Whereas Sherlock and Supernatural left their mark on everyone irreparably, which oh I always say, anytime I mention that I made it to watching season 10-ish of Supernatural, to people in the real world, they're just like, oh wow, that's dedication. But to people who are also very online, it's just like, ah, you gave up. And it's like, yes, I did. I did give up. Yeah. So, optimistically, next Monday, also at 11, assuming I don't lose all concept of linear time and forget when Monday is, which is always a very real possibility. Yeah, that's a good. The show Supernatural was supposed to stop after season 5, and you can kind of tell that it was supposed to stop at season 5. Would a reminder help or hinder? Theoretically help, but also, who's to say? I I never know what day it is. But theoretically I will know when Monday is. Um I will also be trying to coherently um field for content warnings for sections that I anticipate getting to, now that I know that roughly an hour is maybe 20 pages of book. Yes, that hour and a half almost of mostly solidly reading did cover about 20 pages of this, because this is the Barnes and Noble edition. That is also my earring. I don't know if that's visible. Is also, can I do I understand how cameras work? There we go. E. but also this is the tiniest print ever. So that was less than 20 pages of book. Probably that feels a quarter of the story. That feels, well, let's see, where does it stop being okay? So that's, yeah, that's about a quarter of the way through. And me being able to cognizantly read for about an hour is possible. I just have to bring the brain cell. Ah, you have the ebook open. That makes sense. But yes, until next week, I need to do better about doing thumbs up that is visible in the camera. Ye, good night, and etc. Thank you.